The turkey sandwich sat half-made on the counter when Frank Coleman's voice boomed across the shop. "What the hell are you doing, kid? My grandmother could make that sandwich faster, and she's been dead for 10 years. Every customer in Tony's Subs turned to stare at me. My face burned red as I fumbled with the lettuce. I was 16, working my first real job, and this was only my second week. Frank stood behind me, arms crossed, his beer gut pressing against his stained polo shirt. The lunch rush had started, and I was still learning the ropes, but Frank didn't care about that. He cared about showing everyone who was boss. "Move faster or move out," he barked, loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. The customers shifted uncomfortably. One woman shook her head in disgust, but Frank just grinned, enjoying the show. That was the day I realized he wasn't just strict, he hated me. Every task became a test. Frank would stand over me with his cheap digital watch, timing how long it took to slice tomatoes. 35 seconds for 4 slices? Are you kidding me? The pros do it in 15. He'd quiz me like a drill sergeant. What temperature do we keep the cold cuts at? How many pieces of turkey go on a large? What's the shelf life of mayo? I'd answer correctly, but he'd find something wrong anyway. My hands would shake as I worked, knowing he was watching. The other employees started giving me sympathetic looks. During my break, I'd sit in the back storage room, trying to calm down. My stomach would twist into knots every time I heard his heavy footsteps approaching. The worst part was how he seemed to enjoy it. He'd smile when he saw me flinch. One afternoon, my coworker Jake pulled me aside. "He's got it out for you," Jake whispered, glancing around nervously. "Be careful, man. I've never seen him this bad with anyone." It was during a slow Tuesday afternoon when Frank delivered the cruelest blow. I'd mentioned to another employee that I was saving money for college. Frank overheard and laughed. "College? You?" He wiped his hands on his dirty apron and shook his head. "Kid, you can barely handle making sandwiches. What makes you think you're smart enough for college? Save your parents the embarrassment and just accept what you are." The words hit harder than any yelling ever could. I stood there, frozen, holding a mop I'd been using to clean the floor. The other employee looked away, uncomfortable. Frank wasn't done. "People like you don't go to college. You work jobs like this your whole life. That's just how it is. Stop dreaming about things that'll never happen." Something cold settled in my chest. I gripped the mop handle tighter and nodded. But inside, I made a silent promise. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. That was my mistake. I should have quit right then. The cash register became off limits after 3 weeks. Frank claimed I was too slow with money and might confuse the customers. Really, he was treating me like a potential thief. While other employees handled transactions, I was stuck in the back, washing dishes and prepping vegetables. The isolation stung worse than the yelling. During busy lunch rushes, I'd watch through the kitchen window as Jake and the other workers interacted with customers, building their confidence and skills. Meanwhile, I scrubbed mayo containers and counted pickles. "You're lucky I even let you touch the food," Frank would say, passing by with his arms full of supply boxes. "Most places wouldn't hire someone so..." He'd pause, pretending to search for the right word. Unreliable. The other employees knew it was unfair, but nobody spoke up. Frank controlled their hours too. One day, he cornered me by the walk-in freezer. His breath smelled like coffee and cigarettes. "If you slip up once, you're gone," he said, his voice low and threatening. The smile on his face was pure malice. The whispers started during my 4th week. Other employees would glance at me with pity when Frank wasn't around. During a particularly brutal shift, when Frank had screamed at me for breathing too loud, my coworker Beth approached me during my break. "This isn't normal," she said quietly. "I've worked here 2 years and I've never seen him treat anyone like this." She looked around nervously before continuing. "The way he targets you, it's like he wants you to quit." I appreciated her concern, but what could I do? I needed this job. My family wasn't rich, and I was saving every dollar for my future. Quitting felt like giving up, like proving Frank right about my dreams being pointless. But staying meant enduring daily humiliation. Beth shook her head sadly. "Just be careful. Keep your head down and don't give him excuses." As she walked away, I heard another coworker mutter under his breath, "Don't get too comfortable. He's waiting for you to fail." Frank's sabotage became more creative.
He'd give me impossible instructions, then mock me when I couldn't complete them. Clean the entire grill, restock the cooler, and prep tomorrow's vegetables. You have 20 minutes. When I inevitably fell short, he'd laugh. See, this is what I'm talking about. You can't handle simple tasks. He'd change procedures without telling me, then act shocked when I did things the old way. Didn't I tell everyone we're using the new portion sizes? Pay attention. But he'd only told the other employees, leaving me to look foolish. The customers started noticing. Some would give me encouraging smiles when Frank wasn't looking. Others seemed embarrassed by his behavior. One older man actually complained to Frank about his unprofessional treatment of that young man. Frank just shrugged and said, "Some people need tough love to learn." After the customer left, Frank turned to me with that familiar, cruel smile. "Why don't you just quit? You'll never make it in the real world anyway." By my 6th week, the threats of firing became constant. Every shift started with Frank finding something wrong with my appearance, my attitude, or my work from the previous day. "Your shoes aren't clean enough, your uniform is wrinkled, you forgot to wipe down that table last night." None of it was true, but truth didn't matter to Frank. He'd write me up for imaginary infractions, building a paper trail to justify my eventual termination. The emotional abuse reached its peak during a busy Friday afternoon. I'd been working nonstop for 4 hours when I accidentally knocked over a small stock of cups. They weren't even damaged, but Frank exploded. "That's it. I've had enough of your carelessness. One more mistake and you're out here permanently." His face was red, spittle flying as he screamed. Every customer in the restaurant stared. I stood there, taking it, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Inside, rage boiled like lava. I whispered to myself, so quietly only I could hear, "One day, you'll regret this." I never told my parents how bad it really was. When they asked about work, I'd give vague answers. "It's fine, learning a lot." The truth was too humiliating to admit. How could I explain that a grown man seemed to hate me for no reason, that I was being tortured for minimum wage? My pride wouldn't let me confess that I might not be strong enough to handle a simple job. At night, I'd lie in bed replaying the day's humiliations. Frank's laughter echoed in my head. His cruel words about my college dreams cut deeper each time I remembered them. I'd imagine confronting him, telling him exactly what I thought of his petty tyranny. But the next day, I'd walk into work with my head down, ready to take whatever abuse he dished out. The secrecy made everything worse. I felt completely alone, trapped in a cycle of daily degradation. Frank seemed to sense his total control over me. He'd smirk whenever our eyes met, knowing I wouldn't fight back, knowing I couldn't escape.
Football season arrived like a lifeline. Coach needed all his players for conditioning, which meant mandatory after-school practices. I'd have to leave work early several days a week. When I told Frank, his face darkened. "So you're choosing some stupid game over your job responsibilities?" He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "That's exactly the kind of attitude I expected from someone like you." But there was nothing he could do about it. I needed to leave by 3:30, and that was final. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some power. The early departures meant fewer hours with Frank, less time for his psychological torture. As my last day before the season approached, I should have felt victorious. Instead, it felt like retreat. I wasn't beating Frank, I was running away. The night before my final shift, I stared at my uniform hanging in my closet. Tomorrow, I'd walk out of Tony Subs for the last time. But instead of triumph, I felt hollow. Deep inside, a voice whispered with quiet determination, "I will get revenge." 10 years passed. It was 2008, and I was driving through my old neighborhood when I saw the familiar red and white sign. Tony Subs looked exactly the same, down to the faded awning and cracked sidewalk. My successful career in marketing had taken me far from this place, but seeing it brought everything flooding back. Frank's cruel laughter, the daily humiliation, the way he'd crushed my teenage confidence with surgical precision. I'd built a good life despite his predictions. College had led to a great job, respect from colleagues, and financial stability. Everything Frank said I'd never achieve, I had accomplished. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as memories crashed over me like waves. Part of me wanted to drive away and never look back, but another part, the part that still carried that 16-year-old's wounded pride, whispered a different suggestion. I pulled into the parking lot, engine idling as I stared at the restaurant's glass door. Should I go inside? After all these years, what was the point? But my curiosity won. I needed to see what had become of the man who'd made my teenage life hell. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately, that mixture of bread, cold cuts, and industrial cleaning solution. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. The booths were more worn, the floor tiles cracked in places I didn't recall. My heart pounded as I approached the counter, wondering if Frank was even still here. Then I saw movement in the back kitchen. A figure emerged, wiping his hands on a stained apron. My breath caught. It was him, Frank Coleman, 10 years older and looking like 20 years had passed. His hair was mostly gray now, his face more lined and weathered. The beer gut had grown larger, straining against his polo shirt, but it was definitely him. He looked up as he reached the counter, and our eyes met. For a moment, time stopped. I watched recognition dawn on his face, saw his expression shift from routine customer service to something more complex. Surprise, discomfort, maybe even a flicker of shame. "Well," he said, his voice hollow and uncertain, "look who it is." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Frank's eyes darted away from mine, then back again, as if he couldn't decide whether to acknowledge our shared history or pretend I was just another customer. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out what I might want, what I might say. The power dynamic had completely shifted. I stood there in my expensive suit and polished shoes, looking down at the man who once controlled every move I made. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished. The confidence and cruelty that had defined him were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. "It's been a while," I said carefully, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. Frank nodded slowly, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his apron. Yeah, it has." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "So, what can I get you?" The question hung in the air like a peace offering, but we both knew this wasn't about sandwiches. This was about the past, about power, about the boy he'd tried to break, and the man I'd become despite his efforts. Up close, the changes in Frank were even more dramatic. His skin had a grayish tint, and his eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion. The swagger was completely gone, replaced by the hunched posture of someone who'd been beaten down by life. He looked decades older than he should have been, worn out in a way that spoke of disappointment and failure. "You look," I started, then stopped myself. There was no kind way to finish that sentence. Frank seemed to understand. "Yeah, well, life catches up with all of us eventually." His laugh was bitter, nothing like the cruel chuckles I remembered. He moved slowly as he prepared to take my order, his movements lacking the aggressive energy that used to intimidate me. The restaurant was nearly empty, just one other customer in a corner booth. I noticed dust on the display case, outdated promotional materials on the walls. This place was dying, and Frank was dying with it. "So," he said, not meeting my eyes, "what happened to you? After you left, I mean." The question carried weight. He wanted to know if my predictions had come true, if I'd failed like he said I would. "I'll take a turkey sub," I said, watching as Frank's hands moved to prepare my order. Those same hands that used to gesture dismissively at my work now trembled slightly as he sliced the meat. The role reversal was complete. Here I was, the customer, while he served me. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us. He worked quietly, adding lettuce and tomatoes with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times. But there was no pride in his movements anymore, no sense of authority. He was just going through the motions. Another day in what seemed like an endless series of identical days. "Anything else on there?" he asked as his voice flat. I watched him work, remembering how he used to criticize every aspect of sandwich making. Now his own technique seemed sloppy, uninspired. The irony was perfect. This man who once acted like sandwich artistry was life or death serious, now treated it like the meaningless task it had always been. When he handed me the wrapped sub, our fingers briefly touched. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if the contact burned him. "So, what do you do now?" Frank asked as he rang up my order. The question was casual, but I could hear the anxiety underneath. He was bracing himself for my answer, probably expecting me to say I was still struggling, still proving his harsh predictions right. "I work in marketing," I replied simply. "Account management for a firm downtown." I kept it modest, not mentioning the title or the salary or the respect I'd earned, but even that simple success was clearly more than Frank had expected. Something flickered across his face. Regret, maybe? Or just the bitter recognition that he'd been wrong. That's good, he said, though the words seemed to stick in his throat. College worked out then. The question was loaded with the memory of his cruel dismissal of my academic dreams. I nodded. Yeah, it did. We stood there in awkward silence as he processed this information. The kid he told would never amount to anything had proven him completely wrong. Meanwhile, here he was in the exact same place, doing the exact same job, looking like life had chewed him up and spit him out. Frank tried to act unaffected, but bitterness leaked through his forced casual demeanor. Well, good for you, he said, though his tone suggested anything but congratulations. Not everyone gets lucky breaks like that. Lucky breaks, as if my success was just chance, not the result of hard work and determination. The same arrogance was still there, buried under layers of disappointment and defeat. I looked around the restaurant while he processed my payment. The place was in obvious decline. Several light bulbs were burned out, giving everything a dim, depressing atmosphere. The tile floor was cracked in places I didn't recall. Only 2 other employees were visible, both looking as worn down as Frank. This wasn't the thriving business I remembered from my teenage years. It was a place slowly dying, taking everyone inside with it. Business been good? I asked, though the answer was obvious from what I could see.
Frank's jaw tightened. He knew I could see the decline, the failure, written all over his establishment. You know how it is, Frank said with a forced laugh that fooled nobody. Ups and downs. But then, as if he couldn't help himself, the truth started leaking out. The laugh turned bitter, more genuine. Actually, if I'm being honest, the owners are, well, let's just say they barely keep me around anymore. The admission clearly surprised him. I could see him regretting it immediately, his face flushing with embarrassment. Here he was, confessing weakness to someone he'd once dominated. The power structure had completely reversed, and we both felt it. Competition's tough, he continued, as if explaining would somehow lessen the humiliation. All these chain places moving in, hard for the little guy to compete. But I knew it was more than that. Looking around at the neglected restaurant, seeing Frank's defeated posture, it was clear the problem was deeper. This wasn't just market forces, this was personal failure. Years of poor decisions and bitter attitudes finally catching up. The man who'd once acted like he owned the world was barely hanging on to his job. Karma was already at work, and it had been thorough. Memories flooded back as I unwrapped my sandwich. I could hear Frank's voice from a decade ago. People like you don't go to college. You'll never make it in the real world. Why don't you just quit? Every cruel word, every humiliating moment came rushing back with vivid clarity. But now, standing here as an adult, successful and confident, those memories felt different. They still stung, but they no longer had power over me. Frank watched me take my first bite, and I could see the discomfort in his eyes. He knew what he'd done to me. He remembered the cruelty, the targeting, the systematic destruction of a teenager's confidence. And now, he had to serve me. Had to be polite and professional to the kid he'd once tried to break. The sandwich tasted ordinary, nothing special, but eating it felt symbolic, like I was consuming the past and transforming it into something manageable. This wasn't the terrifying tyrant of my memories. This was just a tired, defeated man who'd peaked as a sandwich shop manager. The realization was both liberating and oddly disappointing. I took another bite, slower this time, deliberate and thoughtful. Frank watched uncomfortably, shifting his weight from foot to foot. The silence between us grew heavy with unspoken history. Finally, I swallowed and looked directly at him. "Funny," I said, my voice calm and measured. "I remember when you told me I'd never make it." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Frank's face went pale, then flushed red. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. He knew exactly what I was referring to. There was no playing dumb, no pretending he didn't remember the cruelty.
For a moment, I thought he might apologize. His expression shifted through several emotions: shame, regret, maybe even fear. But then his old defensive instincts kicked in. I was just trying to teach you about the real world," he stammered. "Sometimes people need tough love to..." "Tough love?" I interrupted softly. "Is that what you called it?" He fell silent again, finally understanding that his excuses sounded pathetic now. The tough love defense crumbled when faced with my obvious success. Frank stood there, completely deflated. All the authority and intimidation that had once made him terrifying were gone, leaving behind just an ordinary man who looked tired and beaten down by life. He couldn't meet my eyes anymore. His gaze drifted to the counter, to the floor, anywhere but my face. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. I could see him struggling for something to say, some way to regain control of the conversation. But there was nothing. No comeback, no excuse, no way to spin the past into something other than what it was: the systematic bullying of a teenage employee by a small-minded tyrant. He started, then stopped. "I mean, if you need anything else..." His voice trailed off weakly. This wasn't the man who'd once commanded my fear and respect. This was someone who'd been thoroughly defeated by life itself, and he knew it. Standing there with my half-eaten sandwich, I realized I had all the power now. The question was what to do with it. Part of me wanted to twist the knife, to give him a taste of the humiliation he'd once dished out. But looking at his broken posture, I wondered if that was necessary. Life had already done the work for me. The moment stretched between us, loaded with possibility. I could say anything I wanted now. I could tell him exactly what his cruelty had done to me, how it had affected my confidence and self-worth. I could describe the nights I'd gone home feeling worthless, the way his words had echoed in my head during difficult times in college. I could make him understand the real cost of his casual cruelty. Or I could go the other direction. I could be gracious, maybe even offer some form of forgiveness. Show him that despite his worst efforts, I'd turned out fine. Prove that I was the bigger person. But as I looked at Frank's defeated form, hunched shoulders, and hollow eyes, I realized something important. Neither approach felt right. Attacking him would be punching down at someone who'd already been thoroughly beaten. Forgiving him would imply he deserved absolution for actions he'd never truly acknowledged or apologized for. There was a third option, though. Something that might cut deeper than either cruelty or kindness. I locked eyes with him one last time, letting the weight of our shared history settle between us like a judgment. "Well," I said finally, my voice perfectly pleasant and measured, "it was good seeing you again, Frank." I gave him a small wave, the kind you'd give to any friendly acquaintance. Not warm enough to suggest forgiveness, not cold enough to indicate anger, just neutral. Dismissive, as if he wasn't important enough to warrant strong emotions either way. Frank's face crumpled slightly at my tone. He'd been braced for anger, maybe even hoping for it. Anger would have meant I still cared, that his actions still had power over me. But pleasant indifference was somehow worse. It meant I'd moved so far beyond his sphere of influence that he barely registered as a memory. "Yeah," he managed weakly. "Yeah, you too." I turned and walked toward the door, taking my time, not hurrying like the frightened teenager who'd once fled this place. Behind me, I heard Frank's shoulders slump, heard the small sigh of defeat. The bell chimed as I pushed through the door, and I didn't look back. The sound seemed to echo with finality, marking the end of something that had haunted me for a decade. Walking to my car, I found myself replaying the entire encounter. The teenage version of me had always imagined this moment differently. In my fantasies, I'd deliver some devastating speech that would leave Frank crushed and apologetic. I'd make him understand exactly how much damage he had done, force him to acknowledge his cruelty, and beg for forgiveness. But reality had been much quieter. much more subtle, and somehow much more satisfying. The Frank that I had encountered wasn't the monster from my memories. He was just a small, bitter man who'd never grown beyond the tiny kingdom of his sandwich shop. While I had built a career and a life, he had remained exactly where I'd left him, growing older and more irrelevant with each passing year. The revenge I once craved had already happened, delivered not by my hand, but by time itself. Still, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered, "What if I had said more? What if I really let him have it?" Part of me felt like I missed an opportunity, left something unfinished. A few months later, I ran into Beth, my old coworker from Tony's Subs. We grabbed coffee and caught up on old times. Eventually, the conversation turned to Frank. "Oh, him," she said with a dismissive wave. "He's still there, believe it or not. Never moved up, never left town, just stuck." She stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "You know, I always felt bad about how he treated you. We all did, but nobody wanted to rock the boat. I assured her I understood. We'd all just been kids trying to keep our jobs." "The thing is," Beth continued, "everyone from that time moved on and did well. Jake's a teacher now, Amy's a nurse. Even the part-timers went to college and got good jobs. Everyone. Except Frank."
The words hit me like a revelation. Frank hadn't just failed to grow, he'd watched everyone around him surpass him. Every former employee who'd succeeded was a reminder of his own stagnation. My visit had probably been just one more painful reminder that life had passed him by. Karma hadn't needed my help. It had been working systematically, year after year, delivering a punishment far more thorough than anything I could have designed. Driving home from coffee with Beth, I felt something shift inside me. The anger I'd carried for 10 years, the desire for revenge that had burned quietly in my chest, finally began to fade. I kicked myself briefly for not telling Frank off when I'd had the chance, but then I realized something profound. I didn't need to. Karma had already done enough. My silence had been the loudest revenge of all. By treating him like he was nobody special, like he didn't matter enough to waste strong emotions on, I had delivered the most devastating blow possible. Frank had spent a decade watching his former employees succeed while he remained trapped in the same job, the same mindset, the same small world. Every promotion, every success story, every former teenage employee who'd proved his predictions wrong had been another nail in the coffin of his authority. He'd tried to break me with his cruelty, but instead, he'd broken himself with his bitterness. Life had taught him the lesson I'd once dreamed of teaching myself. Sometimes the universe handles justice better than we ever could. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and letting small people remain small. I smiled as I drove home to my real life, finally free from the ghost of my 16-year-old self's pain.